Welcome back to Nostalgia vs. Reality, where I play the games that define my childhood, whether they've held up or not. Today, we're looking at the PC version of F.E.A.R, developed by Monolith and published by Vivendi in 2005. Every few years, a new game comes out for the PC that more or less functions as a way for owners of high-end computers to show off to their friends who only own consoles. As of late, those games have been the Crisis titles. But in 2005, that game was F.E.A.R. Of course, 8 years later, F.E.A.R doesn't look anywhere near as good as it used to, but that isn't the only element that hasn't stood the test of time. F.E.A.R's most memorable gimmick, and the reason I came back to it in the month of October, is its horror aspect. While I remember being freaked out by the game's array of jump scares at the time, in a world of horror games like Amnesia: The Dark Descent and Outlast, F.E.A.R's scare tactics seem tame, boring, and terribly outdated. Where these new games create an entire atmosphere that gives each scare some sort of context, F.E.A.R simply drops J-horror tropes into office buildings and factories, and quite frankly, it hardly ever works, even when they start making the ceiling bleed. Speaking of which, I really hope you like offices, factories, and warehouses, since those environments encompass everything that makes up F.E.A.R's level design. It seems like the artists spent all their time modeling the accoutrement of an office, along with the limited number of enemies you encounter, of which the majority are conveniently clones, instead of trying to implement any sort of variety. Indeed, it seems like the vast majority of F.E.A.R's storyline has been tailor-made for a horror game with a limited number of 3D models to work with. Beyond the clone soldiers, F.E.A.R also features a creepy little J-horror girl and cannibalistic psychic commander as core elements of the story that regularly appear and try to freak you out before disappearing once again, but not before they lay down some really bad voice acting on you.
They all deserve to die.
Thankfully, there is one element of F.E.A.R that has weathered the storm of time: the gameplay itself. Today's first-person shooters can more or less be split into two categories: games that rip off Call of Duty, and games that rip off Halo. There are, of course, a few exceptions, and even when F.E.A.R came out, the traditional shooter in the vein of a Doom or Quake was already in its death throes, but F.E.A.R embraces the old-school shooter. There is no cover, recharging shields, or health, any sort of aim assist. Of course, Doom 3 had just come out the previous year and was being regarded as the last of the great traditional shooters. So what place could F.E.A.R possibly have? Thankfully, the game has one mechanic that differentiates it from other shooters: the implementation of bullet time. While Max Payne had certainly done it in the third-person perspective a few years prior, F.E.A.R does it on a much higher and more interesting level. The game revels in the fact it's a traditional shooter, with cartoonish amounts of blood and gore spewing everywhere in slow motion, with bullets whizzing by, and at the end of the battle, all that remains are bodies and dust. The game has a gleeful fun to it that simply does not exist in shooters today, and for that alone, it remains extremely enjoyable. So, does F.E.A.R hold up to my childhood memories of it? I'll be honest, when I decided to review the game, all I really remembered about it were the J-horror-esque jump scares, and I figured there was no way this game could hold up to the test of time. While I was right on a certain level, the scares certainly don't hold water anymore. I couldn't have been more wrong about the game as a whole. Today, F.E.A.R is perhaps more fun than ever, a welcome break from the monotony of modern first-person shooters, and an excellent addition to anyone's collection who has somehow managed to not yet buy it.